Hello, teleSUR English presents a new episode of China Now, a Wave Media's production that showcases the culture, technology and politics of the Asian giant. In this first segment, the Global Arena invites Jeffrey D. Sachs, Economics and Director of Sustainable Center at Columbia University, to talk about the path to peace in the Middle East. Let's see.
The path to peace in the Middle East is the so-called two-state solution, that there should be a state of Palestine as a member state of the United Nations, living alongside the state of Israel, with both states having security. And this two-state solution is the only way to peace, because there are two peoples that have been essentially fighting over the same land for many decades. So why doesn't it happen? It doesn't happen mainly because Israel rejects having a state of Palestine next door, and the United States has backed Israel in its rejection of a state of Palestine. Now, this sounds strange. How could one country object? This should not be the decision of Israel. This should be the decision of the world community to end this hot war, which is now also killing tens of thousands of innocent people in Israel's assault on Gaza. But under the rules of the international system, the creation of a state of Palestine as a UN member state depends on the vote of the UN Security Council. That vote was first proposed already 13 years ago, when the Palestine Authority proposed membership in the UN. When an entity proposes UN membership, it goes to the Secretary General of the UN, and then the Secretary General clears it and sends it to the Admissions Committee, which is essentially the UN Security Council itself. This happened back in 2011. And at the time, Admissions Committee said, well, Palestine meets all the criteria for becoming a UN member state. But Israel didn't want it. Israel wanted to rule over the entire territory. And the United States said to the Palestinians, well, we understand, yes, membership, but why don't you just accept observer status right now? And the Palestinians, who are vulnerable and weak, said, okay, if the US says so, because the US promised it will soon be followed by membership. That was yet another lie of many, many lies over many decades. So 12 years later, in the context now of a massive, cruel, war crime-ridden destruction of Gaza by Israel, the Palestine Authority said, look, we made this application. We renew the application because it was accepted. It wasn't dismissed. It wasn't rejected. It was put on hold because we listened to the United States. Unwisely, I would add. So this was taken up again, and the UN Security Council voted in April overwhelmingly in favor of Palestine as a UN member state. And then what did the United States do? It vetoed it. So the vote in the UN Security Council was 12 in favor, 1 veto, the US, and 2 abstentions, Switzerland and the UK. Now, this is again one country blocking peace, but the rest of the world is saying, come on, of course we know the answer. So this went from the UN Security Council to the UN General Assembly. And there was a vote in the UN General Assembly, should Palestine be a UN member state? And the vote was 142 in favor and 9 against. Who were the 9? The US, Israel, of course, some very small islands, and a few countries that for whatever reasons fell into the US camp on this. But overwhelming world support. And the UN General Assembly said, well, we need a conference to put this into effect now. The world is united. The UN is the right venue. And the veto of the United States needs to be overcome by making clear that the whole world is on side except for Israel, which opposes absolutely unjustly, and the United States, which has isolated itself diplomatically by this maneuver. In May, the Arab League countries met in Bahrain and had a very good declaration, the Bahrain Declaration, which said, we're ready for peace, we're ready for normalization with Israel, but it must be based on the two-state solution. And this is a peace offering. This is the way to peace. And at the end of that meeting, the King of Bahrain went first to Moscow to discuss this with President Putin. And then he came with the Arab delegation that met with President Xi in Beijing. And the King of Bahrain, carrying the Bahrain Declaration, said, here is the path. So my recommendation is that China strongly support a UN General Assembly backed global conference so that the world opinion is very clear, so that no country has a veto against world opinion, so that it can become clear to everybody that blocking the two-state solution is actually blocking peace. It's not just blocking a state of Palestine, it's blocking the real solution. And in this area, China will, of course, be on the side of the vast, vast proportion of humanity, on the side of the Arab countries, the side of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the side of the non-aligned movement countries, the side of the G77 countries. The US will be diplomatically isolated, but it deserves to be if it's on the wrong side of global opinion. And this is what we need. We need peaceful ways to show that rational, decent thinking leads to a particular solution. We don't need wars for this. We don't need more violence for this. We need to show that the world is united for peace and that that's not even against Israel. That's for Israel's security. But Israel cannot continue to rule over millions of Palestinian people. That's not acceptable. That's not a way to peace.
And now we have a short break, but we'll be right back. Stay with us. Welcome back to China Now. This week, Thinkers Forum welcomes Don Debar, journalist and current affairs commentator, who will discuss on the U.S. harmful propaganda against China. Moreover, we will learn about the current India-China relations thanks to Radhika Desai, professor at the Department of Political Studies of the University of Manitoba, Canada. Let's see.
My friend was Dr. Cynthia McKinney, who is a political science professor at North-South University in Dhaka in Bangladesh. Bangladesh is a Muslim country, as most people know, and her students, her poli-sci students, came to her one day asking about basically U.S. propaganda towards China that focuses on the alleged oppression of Muslims and particularly Uyghurs by People's Republic. They came to her saying, we go back and forth just normally. This is how our families have done, forever. The borders between here and Western China are pretty open, and people flow back and forth and have for 1,000 years. We go there to see people, and we know exactly what it's like. And this stuff that comes out of your government is obviously a lie, and it's ridiculous to us knowing the facts. Why is it that they do that? And so she said, being a college professor, listen, here we are in a college. First of all, we have to make an inquiry what's really happening. How do you do that? We go there, we prepare a study, and we go there and we ask people, what's your life like? And so that's what they did. They prepared a questionnaire, was 3 pages, I think. in English, Chinese, Arabic, and I forget what else. And went around. We went to the Muslim quarters in each of the cities. We went to Urumqi, Dunhuang, Xi'an, and Nanjing. And we spent 3, 4 days in each one working, and then a day or two in each one, looking around and having fun. My first impression when I stepped off the plane out of the airport, looking at Urumqi, was this is a modern city. It's like in the middle of Asia. I think it's the furthest city from any coast in the whole world, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And so I had this first impression of, wow, they're big urban modern buildings visible from the door when you walk out, and everything looked new and bustling and not at all what I would think of as a backwash, like, way in the interior of China, away from the coasts and everything. So that was my very first impression. We stayed, Conrad, for example, was near very close to the largest mosque in Urumqi. And we went to other mosques, and also we made a point of trying to eat and hang out in halal restaurants and other Muslim businesses where people congregated. So everyone that we spoke with, that was, first of all, surprised to hear, because we did ask at some point in time, there's this story about this. Do you know anything about any of this? Have you seen, people being taken away in the middle of the night by guys in trench coats and, all of that stuff? And, people would laugh at how ridiculous it was. Like, how would you describe your life? Would you say your life here? Would you say it's excellent, good, or very good, good, not so good, whatever, 5 or 6 gradients? And what are your experiences with the government, both the local government, dealing with the city? Do you have any problems, with your day-to-day life or business or whatever? The same with the national government. Do you feel that your voice is heard when policy is being made here? Blah blah blah. All these different things that are markers of how do you feel about your environment? Is it healthy and constructive or not? What kind of a relationship do you feel you have with the state? It's kind of marveling to us looking at the way these things have been built. You have the old towns that are in very good repair and preserved and vibrant. And then these rings, where you can see the development as the newer development, these beautiful apartment complexes that here would be characterized luxury apartments and such that ring the cities in huge numbers. And the new city that's developed around them, it's very impressive. So, but we went to the old towns, and we would stop in, for example, here's businesses there. Some of them solicit people to come in, especially they see, foreigners coming through. They made a point, come on in, have coffee, whatever. We went in some places. One, it was a 3-story building, and we went in, and the wife, maybe in her 50s, early 60s, and one of her sisters and one of their friends, all around the same age, are kind of managing the floor, the tables on this side of the counter, well, waiting tables and greeting people and taking orders and such. And then the husband is in the back on the grill, like sweating with a chef's hat on. And one of his friends is sitting over on the side, sipping on a beer. And this is a coffee shop with a little bakery and things in it. So the 3 of us ordered coffees, and the 3 women sat down with us and were talking. So Cynthia did a formal interview with her and one of her friends, not the sister, but the friend. It took like 10 minutes each. And then we all started talking, and the husband came out and sat down and had coffee and stuff. So I was curious about this 3-story building. I said, why would you live? I mean, it's nice and everything, but why would you live here when you have all these modern conveniences, and the views alone from one of those apartments must be magnificent? She said, we've always been here. This is ours. We live here. This is ours. This place is ours. Talking about like the whole community too, where she is ending. I had no idea that people in China, with the socialist and the whole history of it since 1949, had this sense of like proprietorship, not formal, but essential proprietorship, that I own the things in my life. And that impressed me a lot. Then we went to Dunhuang. The scale of Dunhuang is much more See, the word I use here is going to sound strange in the context of what I just said. Much more human scale. It's not so many skyscrapers, a lot of 2 and 3 story buildings. You have the hotel we stayed in. I don't know if it was a replica of an old, like a little petite village. I don't know, like 4 blocks of 2 story buildings with retail on the first floor and various residential on the second. No cars, like walking, and it's like almost like a contained strip mall. I don't know if that's an original that's been maintained or if it's a mock-up, whatever. Very comfortable. We stayed in this place. Across the main street that this fronted on was desert and a mountain, sand mountain. So this was the view from our room, our window. There was a camel ride up the sand mountain, like in real. It felt more like a city, maybe in the 1930s or 40s in terms of scale. Or here, like Greenwich Village in New York City, or maybe like Greenwich Village was 20 years ago, not quite so much auto traffic. And it was walkable but busy. That we went to the marketplace there also. In fact, I sang karaoke there. Now, again, you have 4 or 5 blocks of the streets are closed, there's tables, lined with restaurants and shops on both sides. Well, we went to what's it called, seminary or a place where people study to be imams. We went there and interviewed people who were students studying, and they were most definitely from, they were Uyghur. And also, there were a lot of people that were Kazakh that we met. And also in Urumqi, that was true. We asked about not just the that these students had with with the world as Muslims. Was there a problem? And also officially, because they have the school and the mosque there, how they related to the authorities. And it's inconceivable to me that people would make up the stories that are made up because they're so easily debunked if you actually go and look. But I guess statistically, not enough people have the wherewithal or the interest or whatever to go and look. And so what's on the other side of the world for like 90% of the population or more, your knowledge of it is mediated. The facilities were in incredibly excellent repair. It was like polished. And then at the mosque we went to in Xi'an also, that was another large congregation, large facility. By their appearance, you can tell that there's not a problem with the authorities. There's no sign, first of all, shutting it down, but also whatever resources you need to maintain gold leafing and windows and roofs and pavement and such are obviously available. We went to Nanjing. We went to a halal restaurant. We got there about 4 in the afternoon, and they weren't really open yet. And we said that we wanted to talk to some people, maybe some of his customers, maybe some of the staff, whatever, and have this. No problem, no problem. Get to sit and So we did that, and when we got to that business, there were, I think, either 4 or 5 people seated. This was a real conversation and not just a questionnaire. We got to ask some details about, are you enjoying your life here? Do you feel like you have work that's satisfying, that you have the freedom to choose what you want to do, that your needs are taken care of, you're not worried about living outdoors and, all of these basic things? And do you feel oppressed? Do you feel that the government is breathing down your neck, et cetera, et cetera? We got through all of that. And it was a very pleasant conversation. And the answer to all of it was, of course, we're happy here. That's why we're here. I'm having a good, I have a good life. My children have a good life, and maybe they'll have a better life than mine. But mine, if they have a life like mine, that'll be fine too. We get through all of that. This one woman who was not in the family, I think, said, I'd like to know something. I'd like to know why your government insists on lying to the world about us. You see what our life is like. You hear what they say. Why did that? She got really angry, like very emotional. And it was hard for me, it felt like it, and I know it wasn't, but it almost felt like she was angry with us personally. I think it's because we were there. But she took it very personally. And I mean, obviously you would, right? My impression at the end of all of this, I was more convinced. I had surmised, having studied and participated in U.S. History and engagement in the world. I'm 70 years old now. So, and I've been interested in this stuff since I was in school, 5, 6 years old. So 60 years anyway of having some understanding what's going on, assumed, particularly given the almost cartoon-like presentation they make, that what was being said about China's treatment of Uyghurs and Muslims was not true. I assumed it also knowing the history of China and knowing world history and human behavior. There would be absolutely no purpose whatsoever for China to do these things to people in China because it's never in anyone's interest to do that. China is obviously doing something right. They're very successfully going from where they were about 50 years ago to basically being like the design of the future for our species, perhaps. I was doing this calculus in my head, walking into breakfast one morning in Xi'an, that right now there's 1.5 billion people eating breakfast, and they're going to have lunch and dinner too. That's 4.5 billion meals that have to be prepared every day. And I know everyone here eats. So that alone gave me like a respect for the scale of the operation of the economy in China. So I was suspicious anyway, because I don't buy cartoons very easily. But when I got there and saw the life there would be the envy of most people in the United States if they were looking at it with their eyes opened. You know, that without the haze of propaganda that would looking at this, looking at a city full of people, what people are up to today, how it works, who gets what at the end of the day, most people in this country would be very envious of people in China in the cities that I visited. I think that's the most concise summary of what I saw that I can come up with. I know I'm one of them.
I mean, so I guess I'd like to give my answer in three parts. So the first is that basically what we have now is a shift back to coalition politics. That is to say, Modi relies particularly on two big allies to take him over the 272 mark, which will allow him to have majority government. So this means that he has to soften his Hindutva politics. He has to accept a lot of it. But I think, so there is reason to imagine that he will not be able to be as hardline as he has been. However, whether this will translate into foreign policy is a separate question for a number of reasons. So let me say, first of all, that you have to understand that Modi's party, which is the BJP, which has been in power before, it was in power in coalition between 1998 and 2004, because you see, even after all the mobilization based on Hindu identity and anti-Muslim politics, which they engaged in very strongly in the 1990s, they were not able to pass the roughly 25% of the vote mark. They had to enter into coalition. And so this party has always been in favor of two things which do not augur very well for Indo-China relations. The first is that they have, from a very early point in their history, seen China as the main enemy of India. They have always targeted China, going back to the 62 war. In fact, yes, you know, the 62 war, if you think about it, was a problem, you know, it was based on many mistakes made by India. But because they have consistently kept up this, you know, opposition to Nehru's earlier policy of friendship with China, you know, Hindi Chini bye bye, you know, that Indians and Chinese were brothers, etc., etc. This policy, the BJP, the Hindu nationalist right, has essentially milked the failures of 1962 for everything they can in order to accuse any policy of friendship with China as being misguided, deluded, etc. And by keeping up a very high decibel rhetoric of this sort, they have essentially prevented a process that India needs to go through in order to have good relations with China, in order to benefit from a good relation with China, both in terms of security and in terms of economy. I think Indo-Chinese cooperation could go a very long way. But this whole process is being stopped. And what is that process? The Indian position on the border disputes, which is the main issue that India keeps raking up. The Indian position has been based, as many scholars in India today recognize, on a colonial position, the colonial lines drawn on a map, there are many reasons to believe that the position that India is taking is not a valid one, and that the position China is taking, which is that let's sit down, negotiate, look into the interests, what works, etc. And also, while doing so on the border dispute, let's advance our interests. Let's advance our cooperation on other matters. So China has always been very, shall we say, giving in terms of its relationship with India. But without going through this process of realizing that India's territorial claims are not valid, that they are more open to question, Indians will not come up with any position. Now, come up to a cooperative attitude to China, no matter who is in power. Now, having said that, given the reality that India's position was not viable, history itself, I mean, reality itself exerted a certain type of gravity on Indian government, so that in the period since the 1980s, basically, India and China have engaged in a lot of intensive diplomacy, which continued even under the Vajpayee government. And then also under the UPA government of Mr. Manmohan Singh from 2004 to 2014. And this led to considerable improvements in relations between India and China, and a creeping recognition that, yes, there should be negotiations on the border dispute. And while those negotiations take place, let's also deepen our economic relationship. So all of that was proceeding generally well until it was cut short by Modi. Now, and I want to talk about Modi in a minute, but let me also say one final thing before going on to Modi and the other things he's done. The key to understanding, I mean, or let me rephrase that. The UPA government in particular made big advances in good relations with China. But what you had, essentially, they achieved progress in Indo-Chinese relations, but they did not at the same time transform the discourse within India. They did not say, look, folks, it's time for us to change our attitude towards the border dispute. We need to go through a process of learning. We need to acknowledge that our position is not 100% correct. So they did not put this out in the public discourse. And that means that the Hindu right has continued to exploit anti-China sentiments in India. They have been allowed to remain, and this is a fault of the UPA government. And I think any secure progress in India that cannot be easily reversed relies on having this process, this ideological process in India. So that's about China and the progress. And under Mr. Modi, essentially, I think Mr. Modi is quite well aware that India cannot win any kind of military confrontation with China. But nevertheless, little skirmishes have been exploited to the fullest in an anti-China rhetoric, which then consolidates the Hindu and Indian nation behind Mr. Modi, etc. So he has been totally free, and he has also not been particularly good at pursuing, the economic relationship and so on. So, I mean, quite frankly, I personally think that Modi's foreign policy generally consists of a whole bunch of photo opportunities for himself and other world leaders. In fact, when Modi dresses, as you may know, he has this obsession with dressing in certain ways and, very expensively and so on. So that's all he seems to care about. And the only other thing he cares about is giving his corporate cronies contracts abroad, particularly, as you may know, for example, Mr. Adani accompanied Mr. Modi on a state trip to Australia and came back with a bunch of, mining contracts and what have you. So these are the sorts of things. Otherwise, he really has not much of any foreign policy. So this lack of a defined foreign policy, plus a desire to exploit anti-China and, of course, anti-Pakistan sentiments in India, means that Mr. Modi is not being very conducive to good relations with China. And finally, the third part, which is that Mr. Modi, like the previous BJP government, is also ideologically much more in favor of good relations and ever closer relations with the United States. The best example of this would be that, when Mr. Vajpayee, the previous BJP prime minister who was in office between 1998 to 2004, Mr. Vajpayee, within days of coming to power, conducted a second nuclear test. If you remember, well, you may not remember, but you may know that he conducted a second nuclear test. And he, immediately following on the nuclear test, he wrote a letter to President Clinton, in which he made it very clear that the reason for the nuclear test, is a short letter, and you can find it on the web. The purpose of the Indian tests was to essentially strengthen India's defenses against China. China was regarded as the main problem. And essentially, this was, of course, under Clinton, still in China, US-China relations were better than what they are now. But nevertheless, essentially, Mr. Vajpayee was saying to Mr. Clinton that India and the US should make common cause against China. And this tendency has continued. It has also involved India becoming ever closer to Israel as part of a larger regional strategy. And of course, what also unites Israel and India under Modi, Israel under Netanyahu and India under Modi, and generally Zionism and Hindutva, is the common opposition to Islam and so on. So this is a part of the strategy. So Mr. Modi would dearly love to go ever closer to the United States. However, he faces two problems, as we have discussed on this, many times before. I have discussed with you many times before, and I have said in many other places. The Western economies and the US economy in particular are not in a very strong position right now to offer anything economically attractive to most of their partners. They are not capable of cementing sustainable relationships where they provide some benefit as the bigger partner, as the richer partner to their partners. So, and on the other hand, the US and the West are not so attractive. Then what has happened, of course, is that the Ukraine war has created a situation in which Modi is forced to lean closer to Russia than it would like to, because the other part of leaning closer to the US is also, of course, to abandon India's historically strong relations with Russia, and which have been dependent on two things in particular. One is, of course, great defense cooperation, and the other is a certain economic relationship. Now, defense cooperation has been certainly diluted on the part of the Indians, who are seeking weapons more and more from Western countries rather than from Russia. But at the same time, with the Ukraine conflict, the rise in the price of oil has put India in a bind, and also has given both carrot and stick to maintain at least some kind of decent relation with Russia. The carrot, of course, is that India is able to import oil cheaply, because without this cheap oil, the rate of inflation in India would go up massively, because India is very heavily reliant on imported oil. So there is that. And the stick, of course, is that, that's the stick that India needs to import that. And the carrot is that, of course, many of Modi's corporate cronies are making a lot of money importing cheap Russian oil and then selling it on to European customers as Indian exports, etc. So that there is this kind of circular trade going on. Russia also benefits, etc. So under a new arrangement of rupee-ruble trade that Russia and India have, India has been buying a lot of Russian oil. But on the other side, by the way, the Russians are not particularly happy with the outcome of these arrangements. They had entered it very happily, hoping that everything would be fine. But what they are finding is that while India is buying a lot from Russia in the form of oil, etc., there is not much that Russia wants to buy from India. So Russia is ending up with a pile of rupees it doesn't know what to do with. So that's another element. So that in this ever closer relations with the West, as India would like to distance itself both from Russia and China, but it is finding it hard to do so in the case of Russia. In the case of China as well, I would say that, India's markets are today, like ordinary neighborhood markets in India, are more and more reliant on importing goods from China, which, being very efficiently produced, inexpensive, keep down the rate of inflation, which would otherwise go even higher than it has already gone. So India is reliant on that. Many Indian businessmen would like to keep good relations with India. But nevertheless, India continues to provoke China by joining military exercises in the South China Sea with the so-called freedom of navigation exercises, joining the Quad, getting ever closer with Japan, being happily engaging in the US attempt to transform the Asia-Pacific into the Indo-Pacific, and so on, with India as a major tool. So it's a complex situation. Modi would dearly love to be even closer to the US, but circumstances are not permitting that. So, but nevertheless, Modi is not eager to give in to China. And one final point, many of Modi's acolytes in the media, in scholarship, in the scholarly world, one of the things they point to is that India is losing, that the strategy of moving closer to China, initiated under the UPA, Congress-led UPA government of 2004 to 14, has been very bad for India, because India now has a very big trade deficit, and India is not, is sliding in its world rankings and so on. But the fact is that if you want to do something about India's trade deficit, China is not stopping you. China is offering to sell its products, but China is not stopping India from becoming a manufacturing hub. What becoming a manufacturing hub, an economic power, requires, however, is a muscular industrial policy, a clear development strategy which expands the Indian market. India cannot be an export platform for the rest of the world. And in any case, India first needs to fulfill the needs of its extremely deprived citizens. It needs to increase their incomes. It needs to increase their consumption. It needs to increase. And so creating a larger Indian market with a well-employed, with high employment, good wages, will create a vast stimulus for India's growth, which can be fulfilled by any by a decent economic and industrial policy. But India is not following this route. India has, on the whole, under Modi, impoverished its people, created ever more inequality, shrunk the Indian market rather than expanded it. And all of this is the real reason why India is falling behind, not because of the existence of China or even India's trade with China. I would say that today, a lot of educated Indians are all too happy to raise questions about the one China policy, like the US is trying to do. It's trying to make it ambiguous, right? And it has always been ambiguous. As you know, the moment that the US recognized China in the 1970s, it also passed the Taiwan Relations Act so that it would send arms to China. So that on the one hand, it was saying, one China principle on one China policy. And on the other hand, it was already diluting it. So Indian opinion can go in that direction. Unfortunately, like I said, many people in India recognize that the whole narrative of Indo-China relations has been very problematic in India. But these people still remain a minority. They are, in my view, they are right, but they are confined to certain niches in the public discourse. The mainline public discourse is always that, whatever China does should be regarded as, authoritarian, hegemonic, trying to be hegemonic in Asia and elsewhere, and pursuing its own economic interests and so on and so forth. And I mean, not saying that China should not pursue its own economic interests, but I think China's genius has lain in trying to find mutual benefits with its partners, that, we benefit, but you also benefit. And this is the way in which China has built its relations with its many, many partners in the region and in the world. That is a very important question, and I would say that we do not fully know the answer. On the one hand, one would hope that the existence of the coalition government would put some sort of restraint on India vis-a-vis China, that even when the Congress-led government was improving relations with China, it did not do enough to dislodge the false narrative about India, about the India-China border dispute in India. And with that not having been done, it's quite possible that Modi will be able to make Indian opinion lean in an anti-China direction in those circumstances. However, so that's another element in the situation. And a third element in the situation is how responsible or irresponsible is India's defense leadership. Will the heads of the various armed services be able to say to the Prime Minister, look, Prime Minister, this is a very dangerous position to take. We cannot stand up to any military challenge, any military conflict with China. So please be careful, etc. We don't know whether this is the case. And indeed, from my reading, it's clear that over the last decade, the Modi government has been introducing changes in the army, which are likely to put yes people in top positions. So that, this is, and I also feel that both vis-a-vis Pakistan and vis-a-vis China, the possibility that the Modi government will act in a completely delusional manner not based on any realistic assessment of India's strengths or, for that matter, India's interests, but in a completely delusional manner in its effort to be pro-US and unmindful of the limitations of India's military or economic preparedness. They may very well take a deeply problematic position. They may involve India in wars. I don't put it past them. Given the way in which Modi has taken terribly consequential decisions like demonetization, like the COVID lockdowns, without a care for what happens to ordinary Indians, I think that this kind of decision is not beyond him. I would say that among the educated elite, which unfortunately for us, for the Indo-China relations, is among the most pro-US in the world, the middle class in India is among the most pro-US in the world. Therefore, their tendency is to accept what the US says as the correct position, rather than, India has had a good anti-imperialist past. And in the first many decades of independence, much of India's foreign policy discourse did follow an attempt to understand imperialism, its history, the need to resist it, and so on.
And this was another episode of China Now, a show that opens a window to the present and future of the Asian giant. Hope you enjoy it. See you next time.